spoiled food, risky water, bread made of sawdust. Welcome to your medieval meal. But that's just the start. In this video, we'll follow the rocky path of food in the Middle Ages, from harvesting and storing to cooking and eating. Each step reveals shocking realities about how survival depended not on taste, but sheer luck. The humble grain of wheat, so simple, right? It's in your bread, your pasta, that cereal you scarf down in the morning. But back in medieval times, a single grain was more than just food. It was a lifeline. And if you think farming it was as straightforward as tossing seeds into the ground and waiting, well, you're in for a revelation. Growing it was a battle. Imagine this, kneeling in dirt day after day, pressing seeds into the ground with tools so primitive they look like museum relics. No sturdy ploughs pulled by tractors, no guide on crop rotation or fertilizers, just a lot of misplaced hope and aching backs. Peasants relied on muscle power, animal power if they were lucky, and patience. Harsh patience. Tools like wooden ploughshares had to scrape through stubborn soil. Sometimes they broke. Sometimes the animals did. A sick ox wasn't a small inconvenience. It could derail the entire planting season. And forget the luxury of understanding soil health or pH levels. You wouldn't find medieval farmers testing for nitrogen content. Most soil was overused, drained of nutrients, and coughing out crops like it resented ever being farmed. But what choice was there? The weather was unpredictable at best, apocalyptic at worst. A long drought could turn fields into dust bowls. An unexpected torrential rain could drown budding crops in an instant. And even if the weather played nice for once, the pests had no such mercy. From swarming insects eager to strip every stalk clean to hungry birds swooping in like winged thieves, crops were under siege. Disease was another silent predator. Grains, barley, rye. Viruses struck them all. Entire fields could turn black and wither before harvest, leaving families teetering on starvation. And before you shake your head at all this bad luck, remember, none of this grain even belonged to the people breaking their backs over it. Enter the feudal system, good old medieval economic hierarchy. If you were a peasant, and let's face it, you most likely would have been, you didn't own the land. Your lord did, and that lord had first dibs on everything you grew. A hefty chunk of your harvest was whisked away to the manor long before you could fill a single sack for yourself. Taxes were merciless. A small family's share was often reduced to the poorest quality grains, the leftovers. While your lord ate fine white bread made from pure, untouched wheat, you ate black, gritty bread made from whatever bran and dust you could scrape together. So, yeah, survival was tentative. Picture this, a farmer's family in early autumn. The barley they relied on for their winter reserves is nearly ready to harvest. They've been tending it for months, praying, weeding, shooing off pests. All that time invested, and then the unthinkable. A storm rolls up out of nowhere. Black clouds, high winds, pelting rain. The crops are battered into the mud. Weeks later, the family stares at a barn holding only a fraction of what they were expecting. It's barely enough to fill the tax quotas, let alone eat come February. They'll spend the winter rationing what scraps they have, battling gnawing hunger daily. It's not just disappointing, it's life or death. But let's say by some miracle the grain actually survives the field. Maybe the storms passed by, or the pests were kind enough to find someone else's barley buffet. You've got your crop gathered, and now it's time to thresh it. For the uninitiated, threshing sounds simple enough, separating the grain from the husk. But here's the real picture. It's tedious. You spread the stalks out on a hard surface and then pound at them with a flail. This isn't a fast modern process. It's a painfully slow rhythm of beating, gathering and beating again until your arms protest every swing. Once that was done, not that you were ever really done, it was on to grinding. Ideally, you take your grains to a mill run by either water or wind power. But as a peasant, chances are you wouldn't have access to one of those high-tech, for the time, setups. Instead, there was the good old hand mill. Ah, the joys of grinding grain yourself. Mortar and pestle-style labour. Turn the heavy stone again and again while bits of grit from the grinding stones mixed into the flour. Yes, that means your bread almost always had a little sandpaper texture to it. Grit in your food wasn't just a metaphor in medieval times, it was practically a seasoning. And remember, this wasn't optional. Grain had to be processed after harvest or it would spoil. Mold, rot, rats, you name it, it threatened your hard-earned bounty. So you worked long into the night, grinding away with what little energy was left after toiling in the fields, just to maybe end up with enough coarse flour for rough bread. Exhausting doesn't even begin to cover it. But despite all that, everything the weather threw at the fields, what the pests stripped away, what the feudal system took, what the threshing didn't yield, and even what the grinding stones chewed into dust, there was still the tiniest shred of victory in seeing that grain reduced to usable flour. It meant you had a chance, however slim, to survive. And some days survival was the only prize. Now you've got the flour ground and ready, but hold up, this grain's journey isn't over yet. Milling was a triumph, sure, but getting from flour to table was a tale just as full of obstacles. The grain may have survived nature's battering and the miller's grit, but the real challenge was just beginning. Bread was life in the Middle Ages, quite literally. It was the foundation of every meal, the backbone of the medieval diet. But what it lacked in luxury, it made up for in necessity. Dependence on bread was universal across all classes. Yet what often sat on your plate, if you even had a plate, depended mostly on your social status. For the wealthy, bread symbolized refinement. Their loaves, made from finely sifted wheat flour, were soft, white, and delicate. For everyone else, it was a different story. Picture this: dense, dark loaves made from barley or rye, and if those grains ran low, as they often did, well, anything that could be ground up and baked was fair game. Stretching supplies wasn't just a tactic, it was survival. Peasants had to get creative, but creative doesn't always mean appetizing. To make their grain reserves last through the season, they tossed in a grab bag of extra fillers. Sawdust, ground acorns, even clay, anything that could bulk up the dough without poisoning you outright. That's not to say the bread was entirely safe, though. Stale grain, moldy leftovers, or storage barrels riddled with pests were just as likely to end up in the mix. And the result wasn't pretty. Forget airy slices or that comforting aroma of fresh-baked bread wafting through your kitchen. These loaves were coarse, bitter, and tough enough to tire out your jaw. Rumour has it, some bread was so hard it could stop an arrow. That says it all, doesn't it? Even the grain that didn't turn your dinner roll into a medieval weapon came with risk. Rye was a common staple, but it carried a hidden danger: ergot contamination. This fungus could infect rye crops and sneak its way into bread, turning mealtimes into a potential health gamble. Ergot poisoning wasn't subtle. It caused convulsions, hallucinations, and in extreme cases, death. Imagine eating a loaf of bread and suddenly seeing visions, or worse, your body betraying you with uncontrollable spasms. It wasn't called St. Anthony's fire for nothing. The bread that should have kept hunger at bay could instead bring you to the edge of madness. Ergot outbreaks devastated whole communities, leaving them wondering if the bread on their table was a blessing or a curse. But let's say you managed to dodge moldy grains, ergot fungi, and whatever non-food items were hidden in the dough. You still had to bake the stuff. For many, this wasn't exactly a straightforward, cosy activity. Most peasants didn't have ovens in their homes. Instead, baking relied on communal ovens shared by an entire village, or, if you were unlucky, your local lord's oven, which came with a nice little baking fee. Communal ovens seem practical, but imagine the risks. Contamination was everywhere: burned crumbs, uncleaned ashes, or grease left behind by the previous batch. Theft wasn't unheard of either. In a bad season, someone might decide a finished loaf sitting in an unwatched oven was fair game. After all, hunger makes people do desperate things. Then there was undercooked bread, a real possibility in shared ovens. The temperature control wasn't exactly precise, and loaves could come out doughy in the middle but charred on the outside. Eating half-baked bread carried its dangers. Spoiled grains in undercooked dough were more likely to retain bacteria, leading to sickness. There's an old story of a child sneaking a bite from a cooling loaf. He couldn't resist. But the bread hadn't cooked through, and the batch had been made with less than fresh flour. Just days later, he was bedridden with a fever his parents couldn't explain. Bread, the food of survival, had turned into a hidden threat. For those who managed to make a proper loaf, the payoff couldn't be overstated. A simple, gritty piece of bread might have been the only constant in a peasant's diet. It wasn't pretty or palatable by today's standards, and it certainly wasn't something you'd ever call soft. But it was filling. packed with heavy grains and fibre. It kept people going through grueling days of labour. And despite the risks, having bread at all meant you had some level of security. A decent loaf was more than food, it was a lifeline. This is where we hit the stark contrast between their bread and ours. Walk into a modern bakery and you've got dozens of options. Sourdough, multigrain, brioche, all soft, perfectly baked and practically calling your name through the display case. You buy it, take a bite, and it's perfection. Medieval bread, by comparison, was an act of practicality, not pleasure. There was no variety, no luxury of light crumbs that melt in your mouth. And that sandpaper-like texture from the mill grit, that wasn't just unpleasant, it could wear down your teeth over time. Dental hygiene wasn't exactly medieval humanity's strong suit, so chewing gritty bread day in and day out only added to the problem. Every bite was tough, and it stayed tough. So let's appreciate an often overlooked fact. Today, we take bread for granted. We've got grocery aisles lined with fluffy loaves, all free of sawdust, ergot, and questionable fillers. We don't have to worry if our bread will make us sick, at least not unless someone leaves it out until it turns green with mould. Looking at medieval bread makes you realise how large the gap is between surviving and thriving. Those dark loaves on a peasant's table had one job: keep you alive. They weren't there to be savoured, they were there because you'd collapse without them. If you were lucky, you'd soak your bread in pottage, turning it into a soggy but edible mush, washing down each bite with watery beer. And if you weren't lucky, well, you'd still eat it. There weren't any alternatives. But bread wasn't the whole of the meal. It was the base, sure, but what about what came next? The things spread on it, cooked alongside it, or eaten in celebration of actually having it. While bread had its share of dangers, the other pieces of a medieval meal carried risks of their own. Let's just say bread was only the beginning. Imagine this, a fresh, sizzling cut of meat on your plate. You'd look forward to it, right? It's something we enjoy almost casually now. But in the medieval era, meat wasn't just food, it was a dream. For peasants especially, it was rare enough to make even a meagre slice feel like a festival. Most livestock didn't belong to them anyway. It belonged to their lord, who had the say over how it was used. A cow, a pig, or even a few chickens were valuable assets, not everyday groceries. Killing one for food wasn't just an expense, it was a decision that could set survival back weeks or months. And when the lord needed his share or there were dues to be paid, livestock often disappeared before a peasant could taste it. What was left for them? If they were lucky, maybe bones for broth. If they weren't, they stared at an empty plate and carried on. Hunting might seem like an obvious alternative, but here's where things get tricky. In medieval law, most game animals belonged to the lords too. Their sprawling estates included vast forests, and inside those forests roamed all the deer, boar and rabbits a person could ever want. But if you were a commoner, touching even one of them could cost you heavily. Poaching wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal, and the punishments were severe. Fines you couldn't afford, time in a dungeon, or, in some places, worse. Imagine being so hungry you risked climbing into the woods in the dead of night, setting a snare while praying no one spotted you, only to be dragged off to stand trial. For most peasants, the gamble wasn't worth it. They stuck to their barley bread, left the game to the well-fed nobility, and tried to ignore the echoes of animals just beyond their reach. All this meant that when meat did appear in a peasant's home, it was a moment to savour. Special occasions like a village fair or a wedding might bring out a butchered hog or a slaughtered lamb. But the reality was, most meat had to survive a brutal storage process before anyone could eat it. Without refrigeration, because let's face it, that was a few centuries away, preserving meat was about slowing the clock as much as possible. The most common method was salting. It worked, but it required too much salt, which wasn't cheap. Smoking was another option. It added flavour while helping the meat last longer, but smokehouses weren't something every family had access to. And then there was the simplest and riskiest option, just letting the meat hang. Not exactly airtight, right? Flies hovered around, bacteria crept in, and the meat's chances of going rancid increased with every passing day. Livestock might have been worth its weight in gold alive, but once slaughtered, it was a ticking time bomb of spoilage. But let's get real here. Meat wasn't always fresh when it reached the table. Some families couldn't afford good cuts, so they bought from village butchers who weren't exactly held to modern safety standards. A spoiled piece of meat might be sold off as just fine. After all, a little bad smell wasn't always enough to deter someone starving. There's a story of one family who saved up for weeks to buy meat from their local butcher. It was just a small portion, but they planned to turn it into a feast. Hours of work went into stewing and seasoning it, and when dinner time came, they were thrilled. Until the illness set in. It started with stomach pains, but quickly spiraled into fever and vomiting. What they thought was a hard-earned treat became a nightmare. Meat that had spoiled was teeming with bacteria, but no one had the knowledge to realize it back then. Expensive didn't always mean edible, and even if the meat wasn't already bad, cooking it poorly could be just as dangerous. Cooking was a skill, but the tools were basic, and getting a perfect roast was rare. Poorly cooked meat meant parasites were a very real threat. Trichinosis, a parasitic infection from eating undercooked pork, was common and carried symptoms ranging from mild discomfort to agonizing pain. There's not much worse than finally getting your hands on some meat only to find it fighting back from the inside. And yet, medieval cooks did what they could, even if they didn't know about bacteria or parasites. Heavy seasoning with herbs or salt was one way to mask potential spoilage, but not every family could afford more than a bare sprinkle of salt. For most, meat preparation was as much about improvisation as it was about surviving what happened next. Despite all these hurdles, there were moments when a meal with meat went off without a hitch, and those moments were pure celebration. A stew made from scraps could be transformed into something almost magical with the right additions. Herbs from the garden, vegetables dug out just in time. When meat was properly preserved and safely cooked, it brought energy and joy to people who'd spent days, even weeks, surviving on bland bread and soupy pottage. The taste, even if it wasn't what we'd call gourmet, was satisfying in a way few modern meals can be. For a brief window, the physical exhaustion of medieval labour faded under the nourishment of a rare indulgence. This brings us to a stark comparison. Today, you walk into a grocery store and pass refrigerated cases packed with everything from chicken thighs to ribeye steaks. It's affordable, fresh, and comes with guaranteed safety standards. We rarely worry about spoilage, let alone parasites or disease, and if we do, it's usually seen as the result of neglect, not the norm. Contrast that with medieval kitchens, where meat wasn't just precious, it was precarious. Every bite came with a degree of risk and a level of gratitude that's hard for us to imagine. For medieval peasants, meat was a dream, a reward, and sometimes a danger all rolled into one. When a family came together to share a rare feast, it wasn't just a meal. It was proof that, against all odds, they'd managed to secure something special. It was a moment of triumph in a time when food was often about bare-bones survival. But meat wasn't the only food fraught with challenges. There were other staples, ones far more common, yet no less demanding of creativity and willpower. After all, meat may have been rare, but pottage, the everyman's stew, was an everyday struggle. Let's talk about what made even vegetables a challenge to eat. Think your last bowl of vegetable soup was boring? Imagine sitting down to the same bland stew day after day, week after week, and knowing it might be the only thing standing between you and starvation. That was pottage, the medieval peasant's daily meal. Not a recipe, not a delicacy, just survival in a pot. Pottage wasn't about flavour, variety or nutrition. It was about making whatever was available stretch as far as possible. And whatever was available wasn't exactly inspiring. At its core, pottage was just a thick stew. Barley or rye served as the base, grains heavy enough to provide some substance in a meal, though far from satisfying. Root vegetables like turnips usually made up the bulk. If you happen to have some beans, you'd throw those in too. On a better day, maybe you'd scrounge up some onions for a bit of sharpness. No one considered what went together. You didn't choose ingredients to create balance or harmony. You chose them because they were there. It might cook for hours or even days, with new scraps added in as needed. The pot was never empty. It was the original leftovers. Except these leftovers weren't lasagna. They were more like a slowly decaying science experiment you couldn't afford to abandon. Variety, as you might have guessed, wasn't an option. The vegetables you had depended entirely on the season. Summer brought cabbage and leeks. The colder months might leave nothing but hardy, shriveled turnips. Seasonal eating might sound rustic and charming now, but when you couldn't store perishable food for more than a day or two without it rotting, it got old fast. There were no tomatoes or potatoes in Europe. Carrots were barely sweet in their wild forms. Green peas might have made an occasional appearance in the spring, but for most seasons, colour wasn't a key feature of your diet. If your supply ran out before the next harvest, well, let's just say you became very familiar with the sensation of an empty stomach. Preservation was far from sophisticated. Without refrigeration, vegetables spoiled quickly, and even the near-freezing temperatures of winter couldn't keep them from rotting indefinitely. If you couldn't dry something, you boiled it into the pottage and hoped for the best. Sometimes people scavenged for edible plants and wild herbs that grew near their villages. A mother might go looking for anything, dandelion greens or wild onions, to throw into her family's pot. One story describes a woman desperate to make dinner for her children when all she had left was a nearly rotting cabbage head. She chopped up what she could salvage, leaving behind the blackened outer leaves, and tossed in a handful of weeds she'd found growing near the edge of a dusty field. For her kids, it was just another day. For her, it meant they wouldn't go to bed hungry. At least, not completely. The taste? Let's not kid ourselves. It wasn't good. Spices, which we take for granted now, were wildly expensive luxuries back then, usually reserved for wealthier households. Salt was just as critical as it is today, but even that could be hard to come by in large quantities. For most peasants, flavour came down to onions, or nothing. With bland grains and bitter vegetables as the main ingredients, pottage didn't inspire excitement. One medieval writer described peasant food as tasting like wet burlap sprinkled with sadness. That might sound dramatic, but when your daily meals offered no sweetness, spice, or zest, it wasn't far from the truth. You didn't eat pottage because you wanted to. You ate it because you had no choice. And the way it was cooked didn't exactly help. The long boiling process, though practical, meant vegetables often lost most of their nutrients before they even made it to the bowl. While modern diets emphasise preserving vitamins and minerals, no one in medieval England was concerned about such things. A pot of boiling turnips, barley and beans wasn't palatable. It was just edible. It filled you up just enough to keep you moving through another gruelling day of labour in the fields or workshops. For peasants, pottage wasn't just food, it was a ritual, almost communal in nature. One big pot might serve an entire family for days. Ingredients were a group effort, scavenged from the garden, forests or nearby markets. Sometimes villagers even shared stews in tough times, contributing what little they had to a collective meal. The bond of survival wasn't always enough to make dinner enjoyable, but it was what kept people connected. And yet, with every new addition to the pot, the risk of contamination increased. Rotten vegetables, food already on the verge of spoiling, it all got thrown in because waste wasn't an option. This constant reuse made every bowl a gamble, no matter how long the stew. Simmered, bacteria, mould or other contaminants could easily persist. Something meant to sustain you could just as easily make you sick. Still, for many families, pottage was the only reliable meal. It was basic, repetitive, uninspired, but it worked. That thick, monotonous sludge kept people alive when there was nothing else. It offered just enough fuel to get through another day. Sure, it didn't satisfy cravings and it never brought joy to the table. But when the alternative was worse, well, people learned to live with it. And now just think about how far we've come. Today, grocery stores overflow with vibrant produce in every shape, size and colour, no matter the season. Even items shipped from halfway across the world arrive fresh, clean and ready to eat. Need a kick of flavour? Spices like cinnamon and paprika, once worth their weight in gold, cost a few bucks at most. Imagine offering a medieval peasant the foods we consider ordinary, bell peppers, bananas, avocados, or even a basic salad dressing. They'd probably cry. The kind of variety we think little of now weren't just undiscovered back then, they were unimaginable. Despite all the blandness, monotony and risk, pottage served its purpose. It kept villages alive. It was sustenance at its most stripped-down form, a daily reminder that food didn't have to be delicious to be essential. With every bowl, families knew they'd managed to survive one more day. That's what pottage was about. Not flavour, not luxury, not even satisfaction. Just endurance. So while pottage fed medieval bellies, what about thirst? After all, washing it down was another ordeal in itself, because believe me, drinking plain water was nowhere near as simple as it sounds. Thirsty? In medieval times you'd think grabbing a drink would be one of life's simpler tasks. But no, even something as essential as drinking water came with its own risks. Streams and rivers, the kind you imagine running crystal clear through villages, were more like open sewers in disguise. Upstream, someone just dumped a chamber pot into it. And if not that, then a dead pig was probably decomposing nearby. Parasites, bacteria, and the entire microbial army of medieval Europe lurked in every sip. A drink of water wasn't about quenching thirst. It was a gamble. Would this drink refresh you or leave you bedridden, clinging to life? The odds, rarely in your favour. For peasants, water sources were a shared reality and a filthy one. Even if you scooped from a well, you weren't safe. The water table was easily contaminated by nearby waste, runoff from fields, or even seepage from livestock pens. Rainwater might sound like a cleaner option, but that wasn't much better. Collected in open barrels, it was often laced with its own cast of characters. Birds pooped in it, insects turned it into breeding grounds, and moss thrived unchecked. Everywhere you went, water was more than just unsafe. It was dangerous. If you were lucky, you might survive with nothing more than an upset stomach. If you weren't, you'd face dysentery, typhoid, or worse. That's the kind of risk you had to think about every single day. Beer, on the other hand, was a safer, though more labour-intensive, solution. Why? It came down to the brewing process. Brewing boiled the water, killing off the things that would have turned your insides into a battlefield. It wasn't just a drink, it was a survival strategy. Beer wasn't loaded with the alcohol levels we're used to now either. It was weak, more like liquid bread than anything else. That made it acceptable for children too. Yes, kids drinking beer. Not as wild as you'd think when you realise the alternative was, well, possibly dying from tainted water. It was just the reality of the time, but brewing beer wasn't simple, especially not for peasants. Your wealthy neighbours might have had proper equipment or even servants to handle the task. But you? If you wanted a safer drink, it came with hours of work. First, there was the grain, yet again at the heart of survival. Barley and other malts needed to be soaked, germinated and dried, a process demanding constant attention. Then, the actual brewing. The grains were boiled with water, and hops or other bitter herbs might be added if you had access to them. What you ended up with wasn't the polished lager of today, but a murky, lukewarm concoction that got the job done. This weak beer wasn't for quick enjoyment. It was for daily life, another part of the grind, quite literally. Take a small village, for example. In one home, a mother spends hours tending to a bubbling pot of beer, carefully watching the grains darken and the water rise to just the right heat. It's a day's task, but the result is worth it. A supply of weak beer her family can drink without fearing what's about to stir inside them. Across the road, another family isn't so lucky. They've run out of grain to brew with. A child, too thirsty to wait, heads to the village well and drinks his fill. By the next day, he's feverish, vomiting, and unable to hold down the scraps of pottage his mother manages to feed him. What should have been an easy need to satisfy instead turns into a life-threatening event. Beer wasn't just safer, it was also a comfort. Amid the rough realities of medieval life, it offered a rare sense of ease. Imagine finishing a grueling day of physical labour, crumbling with exhaustion, and being handed a cup of safe, drinkable beer. It wasn't luxurious or fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was functional. For peasants, that mug of weak beer was something reliable after a day full of uncertainty. It was something they could trust, a rare break from the constant risks surrounding them. Sometimes that little reassurance was enough to keep spirits afloat. Of course, access to beer wasn't equal. Peasants often made their own, scraping together what little they had to brew a weaker, rougher version. The wealthy, meanwhile, could afford better ingredients and more refined tools, giving them a higher quality drink with less effort. Communal brewing was another option, though it came with its own risks. Larger batches might be shared among families, but the arrangement depended on cooperation and resources. A delay in brewing could leave everyone waiting, and spoiled supplies could ruin what had taken days to prepare. Nothing was guaranteed, not even something as basic as a drink. And let's not forget, even brewing had its limits. Sometimes the ingredients just weren't there. When grain stores fell short, people had no choice but to risk the water again. And the cycle of sickness and survival began all over. Those who lived in villages with larger water sources or access to springs were sometimes better off, but again, contamination was a constant problem. It's no wonder alcohol became such a sustained part of medieval life. It was often a leap ahead of the alternatives. You could argue it wasn't really drinking culture, it was desperation that kept the barrels flowing. Today, the idea of grabbing a drink doesn't even cross most people's minds as a hazard. Clean water pours out of taps with a simple twist. Bottled versions sit ready on store shelves, promising purity, even to people who already have access to modern sanitation. Your options go beyond water too, from soda to sports drinks to juice flown in from another hemisphere for your convenience. Compared to medieval pressures, our realities might as well be from another planet. But back then, your choices were brutally limited. Take a risk with water, hope your brew turns out, or go without. This wasn't just an occasional question, it was a daily one. And it didn't just stop at drinking. Unsafe water affected every part of life. Cooking, washing, cleaning. It all carried the same dangers. If you didn't get sick from the bread, meat, or pottage on your plate, you still had to make it past whatever liquid accompanied your meals. And that was on top of every other challenge pressing down on you. Thirst wasn't just thirst in the Middle Ages, it was another obstacle, just like everything else. If you ask me, that makes every mug of beer in medieval times a small miracle. A crude, bubbly, faintly alcoholic miracle. It spared people from the worst their water sources could offer, giving them a lifeline in the form of something just barely safe enough. Yes, brewing was work, but it was work people gladly took on if it meant avoiding another outbreak of dysentery or typhoid. Beer wasn't an indulgence, it was practically medicine for a world that didn't yet understand germs. Safe drinks were precious commodities, but that didn't mean food could be trusted either. After all the effort of growing, gathering, preparing and cooking, even a meal itself might fight back. Every bite could hide hidden dangers waiting to strike. Because eating in medieval times, like drinking, wasn't just about survival, it was about surviving the food itself. Imagine stepping into a medieval kitchen. It wasn't the quaint rustic scene we like to picture. There was no sink to rinse your hands in, no soap sitting neatly by. The surfaces weren't stainless steel, they were wood, rough-hewn and porous, soaked with years of spills, grease and grime. And the hands preparing your meal? Yeah, those hands just came from hauling compost or tending to livestock. Not exactly pristine. Hygiene wasn't a priority because, frankly, no one really understood why it mattered. Germs, those invisible, deadly little monsters, were still centuries away from being discovered. Instead, the medieval kitchen was a battlefield, and the enemy was everywhere. Bacteria, pests, contaminated ingredients. Every meal, no matter how carefully prepared, carried risks you didn't even see. Let's start with the kitchen setup, or lack of it. Running water wasn't a thing, so washing anything, hands, utensils or ingredients, was either skipped or done with the same bucket of standing water used for multiple tasks that day. Imagine rinsing vegetables in water that had already been used to clean the cooking pot, or worse, someone's boots. On good days, water might be fetched fresh from a nearby stream or well, but as we've already discussed, that water was rarely any safer than the food itself. With no proper sinks or places to keep things sterile, cross-contamination wasn't just likely, it was guaranteed. And the same knives used to chop up raw meat, they were also used for vegetables, bread and whatever came next, without even the thought of wiping them down in between. Now add pests to the mix. And not just one or two moths fluttering around pantry corners, these kitchens were teeming with them. Rodents were a constant menace. Rats and mice were everywhere, scurrying through poorly constructed homes, gnawing holes in grain sacks, and leaving something extra behind, their droppings. Insects were just as bad. Flies buzzed around, landing on raw meat left out on the worktop. Weevils burrowed into grains while maggots set up shop in spoiled food. Stored supplies offered no refuge. There was no such thing as airtight containers. If it could crawl in or chew through, it did. And there was no way of knowing what had been touching, burrowing into, or relieving itself on the food that eventually ended up in your bowl. The dangers didn't stop there. Grain, a staple of the medieval diet, had an unfortunately high risk of being contaminated in storage. When rats weren't munching on the reserves, their waste was left behind, mixing with kernels destined for the millhouse. A single spoiled sack could infect an entire family, even an entire village, if proper precautions weren't taken. But let's be honest. What precautions could they realistically take? There were no disinfectants, no food inspectors, and no warning labels. You made do with what you had, whether it was fresh or not. Take this for example. A family, proud of the grain they managed to store, finally grinds it down into meal for a long-awaited meal. They bake loaves from the flour, excited to enjoy a proper dinner together. But by morning, the story changes. One by one, family members are struck with vomiting, fever, and severe cramping. The pest droppings that had contaminated their grain weren't visible in the final loaf, but their effects were quick and punishing. What started as a family triumph turned into a tragedy, and all because the food they toiled over was silently poisoned before it even reached the table. Meat was just as tricky, if not more so. If it wasn't stored properly or if it sat out for too long before cooking, it became an instant hotbed for bacteria and parasites. But the thing is, how could they store it properly? Refrigeration wasn't even on anyone's radar. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried. If none of that was possible, it sat in the open air, hung from hooks or laid out on slabs where flies gathered in thick clouds. Spoilage was inevitable, yet the expensive meat meant people still cooked and ate it rather than throw it away. Sometimes they didn't even notice a piece of meat was bad, until everyone who ate it was sick. Other times, they noticed but ate it anyway, convincing themselves that salting, boiling, or roasting would burn the danger right out of it. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Food storage in general was primitive. Leftovers, a luxury in themselves, rarely lasted more than a day or two. Milk turned sour almost immediately, meat deteriorated unless preserved, and grains moulded quickly in damp environments. It was a constant fight to keep food in edible condition. When food spoiled, and it often did, it wasn't just a loss of the meal in front of you, it was a blow to the household's survival. Waste wasn't an option. And everything, no matter how questionable, found its way back into the pot or onto the plate. This endless battle with contamination flies under the radar in most stories about medieval life. It's easy to forget given how removed we are from those conditions today, because now, every part of the modern food process, from farm to table, is guarded by technology, regulation, and sanitation standards. Factories and restaurants follow strict hygiene protocols most of the time, and pests are kept out with sealed containers and pest control. You could open your pantry right now, grab something to eat, and never once stop to think, did a rat sit on this? Or are there invisible bacteria planning to make me lose my entire next week to food poisoning? But in medieval kitchens, that was just the norm. What's even more remarkable is that meals weren't just risky because of what went into them. They were risky because of how they were prepared. With limited knowledge of safe cooking practices, you relied almost entirely on luck. That knife chopping up pig fat might also be used to spread butter, and the wooden spoon stirring the stew was probably last used to scrape ash from the bottom of yesterday's fire. Surfaces were rarely scrubbed clean and were often used repeatedly without washing. Consider this. The average meal prep involved tools handled by dirty hands, touched by unwashed materials, and exposed to every open crack or crevice where dirt, bugs, or rodents had free rein. Yet somehow, despite the unthinkable risk of contamination and the lack of sanitary practices, people survived. Barely, and certainly not always comfortably, but they did. An illness-free meal was a cause for celebration, as rare a victory as a bountiful harvest, or a winter that passed without tragedy. Every meal you ate without getting sick was a win, however small, in a long and exhausting fight to stay alive. So next time you unwrap a sandwich from the deli, pop something in the microwave, or even order takeout, think about how far we've come. Today, hundreds of invisible safeguards protect the food we eat. From hygiene laws to widespread refrigeration and pest control, the risks medieval peasants faced every day have been virtually erased from our modern lives. But back then, eating wasn't just about staying full, it was about staying alive long enough to do it again tomorrow, if the meal didn't kill you first. And here's the crazy part. After all that effort, the act of eating was still only one challenge. The food had to stay inside you, and that wasn't always guaranteed either. Picture this: sunrise and you're already in the fields. Your hands cramp from gripping tools, your back aches from leaning over crops, and the day has only just begun. This was life for a medieval peasant, a life without breaks, weekends, or the concept of clocking out. Your job wasn't just work, it was survival. Ploughing, digging, carrying water, caring for animals, it consumed your days. Every task demanded intense physical effort, but there was no choice. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And yet, the tragic irony was that even after a full day hunched over in the dirt or hauling heavy buckets of water, many people still went to bed hungry. For a medieval labourer, survival wasn't guaranteed even when you put in the work. Food scarcity was a constant shadow hovering over every mealtime. Despite the labour poured into sowing seeds, tending crops or milking livestock, much of what was produced went elsewhere. A lord's manor claimed the lion's share of what the peasants harvested, leaving them with the scraps, a bitter reminder that their efforts were feeding someone else's comfort. Hunger wasn't just an occasional problem, it was a daily reality. And hunger stings more when you know you've done all you can and still come up short. Now, picture a small family huddled together at the end of a long day. They've managed to scrape together a pot of pottage, boiling grains, a few onions, maybe a handful of wild herbs scavenged from the edge of a forest. That's dinner. Everyone stares at the pot, knowing that it's all they'll get. Not just for this meal, but maybe for the entire day. There's no second helpings and no dessert waiting quietly on the side. This same pot of food has to last until the next harvest, weeks or months away. A mother takes a spoonful, then wordlessly passes it to her children, hoping they'll feel full before the pot runs dry. They won't, but she still hopes. Food wasn't just about sustenance, though. Mealtimes meant more than filling your stomach. For all the hardships around them, families often dined together. A communal meal was one of the few constants in an otherwise chaotic and grueling life. Sitting together over a shared pot of pottage wasn't necessarily joyful, but it was a moment. A simple pause in a day without pauses. Parents, children, neighbours, whoever was nearby, shared their tiny portions, communicating silently what words never could. We're still here, still fighting. Meals brought connection in a world where the odds were stacked against you. Even when supplies ran low, the act of gathering to eat pulled families and villages closer together. Survival wasn't an individual effort. Scarcity forced people to rely on one another, but feeding those large households presented its own challenges. Many medieval homes were multi-generational, with grandparents, parents and children all under one roof. In some cases, adding a neighbour's orphan child or a distant cousin wasn't out of the question either. When food was already limited, every extra mouth stretched resources even thinner. Imagine divvying up a stew that's already mostly water, trying to make sure every person gets enough to quiet their hunger, even if only for an hour or two. Arguments over portions? Definitely. Unspoken sacrifices? Probably even more common. Parents often went without to ensure their children had food. It wasn't noble, it was necessary. Think about how that compares to modern family dinners. Today's tables are decorated with multiple side dishes, bowls overflowing with food, and maybe even leftovers, something almost unheard of for a medieval family. And when someone's not hungry, it's easy to shrug and say, "I'll just grab something later." Back then, there was no later. Meals were consumed entirely, if possible, and savoured, not because they were delicious, but because they were there at all. Leftovers weren't stored in a fridge, they barely existed. Even if a bite or two remained, they were eaten at the earliest opportunity. Nothing went to waste, not the broth from stew, not the crumbs from bread, not a single scrap. And when a family did sit down to eat, it wasn't in the idyllic atmosphere we might picture now. There were no perfectly set tables or quiet dining rooms with tidy candles glowing. The food was served where there was space, often on simple wooden boards or even in hollowed-out chunks of stale bread. There were no forks, just knives and fingers cutting or scooping whatever they could get to their mouths first. Children jostled for positions around the pot. Parents kept a watchful eye to ensure no one was grabbing more than their share. To eat a meal as a medieval peasant was a negotiation, a delicate compromise to ensure everyone got just enough to make it through the day. The physical toll of labour didn't just shape how meals were eaten, it shaped when meals were eaten. Breakfast was a rarity for most peasants. There simply wasn't enough food to stretch across 3 meals a day. A typical schedule included 2 meals, 1 midday and 1 in the evening. Essentially, you worked hungry until that first meal, then worked again until the second. Eating was reserved for after the work was done or during a short break in the day. That's not to say the meals themselves were leisurely events. Even when a family gathered, eating was functional, not indulgent. You ate to keep the pain of hunger away, not for pleasure. And yet, despite everything, the backbreaking work, the constant fear of scarcity, the shared struggles, each bite of a meal represented victory. However small, however temporary, it was a triumph over every disaster, every hardship that tried to take it away. Every pot of pottage, every crumb of bread, every sip of weak beer signified one thing: survival. It was a win in a time when life didn't hand out wins easily. You worked, you scrounged, you scavenged, and then, against the odds, you ate. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Now compare that to where we are today. Convenience surrounds us. Grocery stores with stocked shelves, restaurants with endless options, delivery apps that bring food straight to your door. The abundance of choice and availability is something medieval peasants couldn't have imagined. You don't have to worry about whether the grain in your bread is free of pest droppings or if the meat in your stew is hiding parasites. You don't have to wonder whether your family's dinner will last the week or if the portion on your plate has been stretched so thin it barely counts as a meal at all. But back then, every single bite was precious. Every meal was survival made tangible. And that's why medieval meals, as bleak and mundane as they seem, hold lessons for us today. They remind us how fragile food chains can be, how much effort goes into sustaining life, and just how far humanity has come from those days of endless toil and scarcity. For peasants in the Middle Ages, eating wasn't just a necessity, it was an achievement. Each bite taken was a small act of defiance against a harsh and unrelenting world. It wasn't much, but somehow it kept them going. A successful medieval meal wasn't just food, it was a miracle. Every bite you've ever taken without worrying about disease, contamination, or hunger is proof of how far we've come. The next time you sit down to eat, take a moment to appreciate the unimaginable challenges your ancestors faced. They worked tirelessly, fought off famine, and often stared down impossible odds just to survive. Food today is easy, abundant, and safe. But history reminds us it hasn't always been that way. Maybe, just maybe, every meal, no matter how ordinary, is worth being thankful for. So, what's on your plate tonight?